They said Elias Crow was a quiet man, a blacksmith who never raised his voice, who bent iron better than he ever bent rules. On Tillman Boyd's plantation, silence was survival. But the night Elias learned his wife and child were burned alive for defiance, that silence died with them. He didn't run north like the others. He rode straight into the heart of the war, wearing a dead man's coat and carrying a hammer meant for chains. By dawn, Confederate soldiers started vanishing in the woods. Some said it was God's judgment. Others whispered a name, the Black Reaper. But vengeance has a cost, because the deeper Elias goes into his war, the more he starts to look like the men he hunts. They called him a slave. They were right, until he made them his masters in hell. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The dawn light flickered through cracks in the plantation blacksmith shed, casting thin yellow lines across Elias Crow's dark skin. His powerful arms rose and fell with the steady rhythm of his hammer, each blow sending sparks dancing from the glowing iron on his anvil. At 32, Elias had spent more than half his life at this forge, his broad shoulders and calloused hands shaped by endless days of bending metal to another man's will. Overseer Craddock leaned against the doorframe, tobacco juice staining his unkempt beard. His eyes never left Elias, watching each movement with the suspicious gaze of a man who feared what he did not understand. "Put your back into them spikes, boy," Craddock called out, slapping his leather whip against his palm. "Major Boyd's regiment needs them wagon wheels fixed proper before they march." Elias didn't look up. He simply nodded, his face revealing nothing. Years had taught him to keep his thoughts hidden behind a mask of quiet submission. His silence was mistaken for obedience, his skill for loyalty. But inside his mind, Elias was counting days since he'd last seen his wife Lydia's smile, counting hours since he'd heard his son Caleb's laughter. The plantation belonged to Major Tillman Boyd, now serving somewhere with the Confederate Army. In his absence, Craddock ruled with cruel efficiency, determined to meet the endless demands for supplies from the struggling Southern forces. "We got company," Craddock announced, straightening his dirty gray coat. "Show them soldiers what good work you do for the cause." 4 Confederate soldiers trudged into the blacksmith shop, their uniforms worn and dusty from the road. They carried an air of desperation that Elias had noticed more and more in the Southern men these days. The war wasn't going well. Even here, deep in Louisiana, everyone knew it. "These the wagon spikes?" The tallest soldier picked up a finished piece from the cooling bucket. "Good work. Solid. Elias here's the best smith in 3 parishes," Craddock boasted, as if the skill belonged to him. "Makes anything you boys need." Elias kept his eyes down, focusing on his work, while the men examined his craftsmanship. He pumped the bellows, bringing the coals to a bright orange glow. The heat washed over his face, familiar and comforting in its consistency. Fire, at least, was honest in its nature. "Say," said one of the younger soldiers, dropping his voice, "ain't this the plantation where they had that trouble last month?" "With them runners?" Craddock's face darkened. "We handled it, made an example." The soldiers exchanged knowing glances. The youngest one snickered. "Heard about that. Quartermaster caught that woman hiding food, right? Then her and the boy tried to run?" Elias's hammer paused mid-strike for just a moment. His ears sharpened, though his expression remained unchanged. "Disciplinary burning's what they got," said the oldest soldier, leaning close to his companions. "Lieutenant Boyd, the major's cousin, he ordered it personally. Said it would teach the rest a lesson about stealing from the army." "Woman screamed something fierce," the young one added with a laugh, "but the boy went quiet real quick once the smoke got thick." The hammer in Elias's hand suddenly felt very heavy. Lydia, Caleb, his wife, his son, his family. He'd been told they'd been sold away while he was working at the neighboring plantation mending plows. A lie. They hadn't run. They hadn't stolen. Lydia had always shared what little they had with those who needed it more, and they had burned for it. Elias brought the hammer down on the glowing metal. The sound rang out sharper than before. "You still got more of them spikes to finish?" Craddock demanded, oblivious to the storm building behind Elias's calm exterior. "Yes," Elias said, his voice low and even. "I'll finish them by sundown." The soldiers left soon after, their laughter echoing behind them. Craddock followed, shouting orders at field hands as he went. Elias was left alone with the fire, the iron, and the truth that now burned inside him hotter than any forge. As the day wore on, he worked mechanically, his body performing the familiar tasks while his mind traveled back through memories. Lydia's gentle hands braiding Caleb's hair, his son's bright eyes watching him work the bellows. "Papa, show me how the metal bends again." The way Lydia would sing softly in the quarters at night, her voice bringing peace to those who had none, all gone, turned to ash on the orders of men who saw them as property, not people. When dusk came, Elias was alone in the shed. The last spike lay before him, glowing red-hot in the dimming light. He'd made it differently, longer, sharper, with a flattened edge like a blade. This one wasn't for any wagon. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the spike with his tongs. Rather than hammering it further, he slowly lowered it into the water trough. The metal hissed and steamed as it met the cool water, a sound like a whispered promise. "Iron remembers fire," Elias murmured, words his father had taught him long ago. The metal never truly forgot the heat that had shaped it, just as Elias would never forget what had been done to his family. He pulled the cooled spike from the water and slipped it into his leather apron pocket. The weight of it pressed against his leg. His first weapon, forged not just with skill but with purpose. The sun set beyond the trees, casting long shadows across the plantation. In the gathering darkness, Elias bowed his head, but he did not pray for mercy or freedom. He prayed for something darker, something that had never before entered his heart. He prayed for vengeance. Midnight draped itself over the plantation like a heavy blanket. The forge stood silent, its fires banked to glowing embers that cast weak orange light across the dirt floor. Outside, crickets hummed their endless song, a sound that had once lulled Elias to sleep, but now only marked the passing minutes until his plan would begin. He sat on his wooden stool, turning the iron spike over in his hands. The metal caught the dim light, its point sharp enough to pierce leather and flesh with equal ease. He had shaped it for this purpose, not for wood or wagon, but for a man's throat. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel path made Elias quickly slip the spike back into his apron pocket. He picked up a broken plow chain instead, laying its links across his anvil as the door creaked open. "What in God's name you doing up at this hour, boy?" Overseer Craddock's bulk filled the doorway, his face flushed with drink. A half-empty bottle dangled from his fingers. "Thought I seen light in here." Elias kept his eyes lowered, his voice measured and calm. "Found this chain broken, sir. Need it fixed for tomorrow's plowing. Thought I'd get ahead." Craddock snorted, staggering into the shed. "Always the good worker. That's why the Major keeps you fed better than the others." He took a long pull from his bottle. "Got any of that fancy work done for the soldiers yet?" "Yes, sir. Finished the spikes." Elias gestured to the neat row of metal pieces on his workbench. "Just this chain left to mend." The overseer picked up one of the spikes, testing its point against his thumb. "Good enough to skewer a Yankee, I reckon." He laughed at his own joke, then narrowed his eyes at Elias. "You ever think about running to them blue bellies? Hear they're promising freedom to any slave who joins up." "No, sir." "Never." The lie came easily to Elias's lips. He pumped the bellows gently, bringing the forge's embers to a brighter glow. Smart. Craddock leaned against the wall, his eyes growing distant. Some ain't so smart. Like that woman of yours. He took another drink. What was her name? Lydia? Elias's hand froze on the bellows. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his face revealed nothing. Yes, sir. Lydia. Lieutenant Boyd. He told me how she fought when they caught her with that food. Craddock's voice turned taunting. Said she begged real pretty when they lit that fire. Boy didn't make much noise, though. The heat from the forge seemed to flood Elias's veins. Every muscle in his body tightened like metal under the hammer. You know what she screamed at the end? Craddock continued, his cruel smile widening. Your name. Over and over. Elias! Like you could save her? Elias stood slowly, the broken chain dangling from his left hand. Sir, could you hold this link steady for me? Need to see where it's weak. Craddock, too drunk to be suspicious, pushed himself off the wall. Make it quick. Some of us need our sleep. Won't take but a moment, sir. The overseer leaned over the anvil, his thick fingers gripping the chain. His neck stretched forward, exposed in the dim light. Elias moved behind him, one fluid motion born from years of careful restraint. You know, I sometimes think I can still hear her screaming, Craddock said with a chuckle. So can I, Elias whispered. In one swift motion, he pulled the iron spike from his pocket and drove it through the back of Craddock's throat with all the force of his blacksmith's arm. The overseer's eyes bulged with shock. Blood spurted from the wound, splashing hot across Elias's hands. Craddock tried to scream, but the spike had pinned his tongue. Only a wet gurgle escaped as he thrashed against the anvil. Elias held him there, watching the life drain from the overseer's eyes. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no guilt. Just a cold certainty that this was only the first death in what would become a long trail. When Craddock stopped moving, Elias let the body slump to the ground. He didn't pause to reflect. Instead, he moved with purpose, kicking over the bellows, sending burning coals scattering across the dry hay that lined the floor. Flames licked upward, catching the wooden beams overhead. The fire spread quickly, hungrily devouring the shed where Elias had spent so many years in captive labor. He grabbed a satchel he'd hidden beneath the floorboards days before, containing a knife, some hardtack, and a crude map. As smoke began to fill the space, he stepped outside into the cool night air. The alarm hadn't been raised yet. Elias moved silently through the darkness toward the slave quarters, a low row of shabby cabins behind the main house. He knew exactly which doors to knock on. Jonas answered first, his wiry frame tensing at the sight of Elias's blood-spattered apron. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered. "What you done?" "What needed doing?" Elias replied. "You coming or staying?" Jonas needed no further explanation. At 40, he had survived by keeping his head down, but the fire now blooming from the blacksmith shed told him everything had changed. He grabbed a small bundle from beneath his pallet and nodded. Next door, young Marlowe blinked sleep from his eyes. At 18, the stable hand still carried hope in his face. "We running north?" he asked, excitement breaking through his fear. "You and Jonas are," Elias said. "I'm going another way." Behind them, shouts began to rise as the fire spread to nearby buildings. The plantation was waking to chaos. Elias led the two men toward the stables, where Confederate horses were kept for messengers and officers. "Take what you need," Elias told them, as he selected a strong mare for himself. "Head for the Union lines. They're not far past the Mercer Creek." While Jonas helped Marlowe saddle a horse, Elias found a ragged gray coat hanging on a peg, a soldier's spare left for mending. He pulled it on over his bloodied clothes. "What you doing with that rebel coat?" Jonas asked, his voice tight with concern. Elias mounted the mare, settling into the saddle with unexpected ease. "Going where they won't look for me." The glow from the spreading fire now lit the night sky, turning clouds to crimson above the plantation. Men were running, shouting orders, trying to form bucket lines to save the main house. No one noticed 3 black men slipping away from the stables. At the edge of the property, where the path split between north and south, Jonas reined his horse to a stop. "Elias, north is freedom. South is just more Confederates, more masters." Elias paused, looking back at the red glow painting the horizon behind them. The plantation that had owned him was burning, but the fire inside him burned hotter still. "North can wait," he said quietly, turning his horse southward toward the swamps where the war raged. "Hell's the other way." Dawn crept through the Louisiana swamps, painting the cypress trees with weak gray light. Elias rode slowly, his mare picking a careful path through the boggy ground. Thick mist hung between the trees, swirling around gnarled trunks that rose from black water like the fingers of drowned men. The air smelled of rot and wet earth. Elias's hands were blistered raw from riding through the night. Dried blood and soot smeared his face and arms, giving him the look of a man who'd crawled from a grave. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. The plantation was miles behind him now, but vengeance drove him forward like a whip. He passed abandoned homesteads, their doors hanging open, chickens gone wild in the yards. The war had emptied these places. Their owners fled or dead, leaving only ghosts behind. In one clearing, he found a well, and stopped long enough to wash the worst of the blood from his hands, wincing as water touched his raw skin. "Should have taken gloves," he muttered to himself, the first words he'd spoken since leaving Jonas and Marlowe. The sound of his voice startled a heron from the reeds nearby. As the sun rose higher, burning off some of the mist, Elias heard voices ahead, men shouting, horses stomping. He slowed his mare and dismounted, tying her to a low branch before creeping forward on foot. Through the trees, he saw a Confederate supply convoy stopped on the narrow road. 4 wagons loaded with barrels and crates sat idle, while a dozen soldiers cursed and strained around the lead wagon. The front axle had snapped, tilting the whole wagon to one side. The men struggled to lift it high enough to remove the broken piece. Their officer, a young lieutenant with a neatly trimmed beard, paced nearby, checking his pocket watch with growing irritation. Elias studied them from the shadows. His first thought was to wait until they left, then follow and attack when they camped. But another idea formed, one that might give him better results than simply killing a few men. He needed information, access, and time. Taking a deep breath, Elias arranged his face into a mask of nervous deference, the same expression he'd worn for years when addressing white men. He hunched his shoulders slightly, lowered his eyes, and stepped out of the trees. "Morning, sirs," he called, his voice pitched careful and humble. "Looks like you got trouble there." The soldiers spun toward him, several raising rifles. The lieutenant strode forward, hand on his pistol. "Hold there! Who the devil are you?" the officer demanded. Elias raised his hands slowly. "Name's Samuel, sir. Was a blacksmith for Mr. Johnston over in Baton Parish before the Yankees came. Been looking for honest work since freedom came." The lie flowed easily from his lips. The lieutenant looked him up and down, noting the soot and calluses. "You say you're a smith?" "Yes, sir. Best one in 3 parishes, if you'll pardon the pride." Elias gestured toward the broken wagon. "I can fix that axle for you, if you got tools." The young officer considered him, suspicion warring with practical need. "We're heading to Vicksburg with supplies. Can't afford delays." "Won't be no delay if you let me help," Elias said. "Got that wagon moving in an hour." After a moment's thought, the lieutenant nodded. "Simmons, get the toolbox from wagon 3. He turned back to Elias. "You fix this. There's a hot meal in it for you." "Thank you kindly, sir." Elias moved toward the wagon, careful not to seem too eager. As he worked, sweating in the growing heat, He listened to the soldiers talk. They complained about food shortages, Union advances, and officers demanding the impossible. The lieutenant mostly kept to himself, occasionally barking orders or checking his maps. When one soldier brought water, Elias used the moment to ask a casual question. "Your regiment been fighting long, sir?" "Since Bull Run," the soldier answered. "Lieutenant Boyd there joined us last year, though. Family's big plantation owners, the kind that stay home while we bleed." Elias nearly dropped his hammer. Boyd. The same name as Major Tillman Boyd, the man who owned the plantation he'd just fled. He glanced at the lieutenant, studying his features more carefully. There was a resemblance, the same sharp nose and thin lips. "That the Major's brother?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Cousin, Lieutenant Silas Boyd," the soldier said. "Major's off with Johnston's army. Left his little cousin to play soldier with us." Silas Boyd. The name burned into Elias's memory. This man shared blood with those who had owned him, who had murdered Lydia and Caleb. His hands trembled as rage surged through him. For a moment, he imagined driving his hammer through the lieutenant's skull. Instead, he turned back to the axle, channeling his fury into the work. "Almost done," he called out, his voice betraying nothing of the storm inside him. True to his word, within the hour, the wagon was repaired. Silas Boyd inspected the work, nodding with approval. "Fine job," the lieutenant said. "Better than our usual smithy. You looking for more work?" Elias lowered his eyes, hiding the hatred there. "If you're offering, sir. Our regiment's short on skilled hands. You come along with us. Keep our equipment working. There's regular meals and even pay when the paymaster comes. Be grateful for the chance, sir." And so Elias found himself traveling with his enemies, riding in the back of the last wagon, watching, listening, planning. Over the next 2 days, he made himself useful, repairing weapons, shoeing horses, fixing broken gear. The soldiers grew to trust him, or at least to ignore him as they would any tool. At night, while the camp slept, Elias moved like a ghost. He loosened wheel bolts just enough to cause breakdowns miles later. He filed down firing pins and dulled musket springs so guns would misfire. In the medical wagon, he found a snake preserved in alcohol, a cottonmouth kept as a curiosity. He extracted its venom sacs, mixing the poison into a barrel of whiskey the officers favored. By the second day, men began falling ill. Stomachs cramped, vision blurred. Accidents multiplied, wagon wheels coming loose on slopes, rifles exploding in soldiers' hands during drills. The men grew superstitious, whispering that God was punishing them for their sins. "Maybe it's that Jonah we picked up," one soldier muttered, glancing toward Elias. "Shut your mouth," another responded. "Man's fixed, more than he's broken. It's this cursed swamp, full of miasma and ghostly vapors." That night, as the convoy made camp by a sluggish creek, Lieutenant Boyd called Elias to join him by the fire. The young officer was drinking from a tin cup, his eyes already glassy from the poisoned whiskey. "You've been useful," Boyd said, words slightly slurred. "Not like most freedmen, always looking for handouts or running north to hide behind Union skirts." "Just trying to survive, sir," Elias answered, feeding the fire with broken branches. Boyd laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet night. "That's what we're all doing, isn't it? Surviving." He leaned forward, firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "You know what I think? No slave's hands are clean in this war. Every one of you is either fighting for the Yankees or helping the Confederacy. Either way, blood gets spilled." Elias watched the sparks rise from the fire, tiny bright stars climbing into the darkness. Each one flared and died, like lives cut short, like Lydia, like Caleb, like all those who had suffered under the Boyd's ownership. "Neither are yours, Lieutenant," he thought, his face giving away nothing, "and soon they never will be again." Morning light filtered through the mist, revealing a camp in chaos. Soldiers lay sprawled across the ground, clutching their stomachs and groaning. Some crawled on hands and knees to the edge of the clearing, where they emptied their guts onto the pine needles. The air reeked of vomit and misery. Lieutenant Silas Boyd stumbled from his tent, face pale and clammy. His usually crisp uniform hung wrinkled from his frame. Dark circles shadowed his bloodshot eyes. "What in God's name?" he croaked, watching as his men writhed in pain around him. Sergeant Miller approached, looking only slightly better than the rest. "Something's poisoned the men, sir. Started around midnight. Half the company can't stand." Boyd pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, fighting back a wave of nausea. The water? The food? Could be either. Or the whiskey. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed as another cramp twisted his insides. "We're not moving today. Make camp here until the men recover." Elias worked quietly, helping to set up tents near a grove of tall pines that stood sentinel at the edge of a small clearing. His own stomach felt fine. He'd been careful not to touch the poisoned whiskey or any food he'd tampered with. He kept his face neutral, showing only concern when soldiers glanced his way. "Need more firewood," he told Miller, pointing to the meager pile they'd gathered. "Men need hot water for tea. Settles the stomach." Miller nodded weakly. "Go on then. Don't wander too far." "No, sir. I'll stay close." Elias picked up an axe and headed toward the pine grove, disappearing among the trees. But instead of gathering wood, Elias circled wide around the camp, marking trails and noting sentry positions. 3 soldiers guarded the perimeter, all looking sick but alert enough to raise an alarm. He studied their patrol patterns, then retreated deeper into the woods to wait. The day crawled by. Occasional shouts from camp told him the sickness continued. As afternoon faded toward evening, Elias sharpened a small knife he'd stolen from the cook's wagon. The blade wasn't much, but it would serve his purpose. Dusk came, painting the woods in purple shadows. Mist rose from the ground like restless spirits. Elias moved silently through the trees, barefoot to muffle his steps, approaching the first sentry from behind. The young Confederate leaned against a pine trunk, rifle propped beside him. His head nodded forward, half asleep from exhaustion and lingering sickness. Elias clamped one hand over the soldier's mouth, while the other drove the knife into the side of his neck. The boy thrashed briefly, eyes wide with shock, before going still. Elias lowered him gently to the ground and took his rifle and bayonet. The second sentry died just as quietly, a quick thrust under the ribs from behind. The third put up more of a fight, managing to land a blow to Elias's jaw before the bayonet found his heart. Blood coated Elias's hands, warm and sticky in the cool evening air. He dragged the first body to a thick pine tree and propped it upright. From his pocket, he took 3 long iron nails he'd forged during his time at the camp. Using a rock as a hammer, he drove the first nail through the dead man's right palm, pinning it to the tree trunk. The sound echoed dully in the misty air. Elias paused, listening for any response from the camp. Hearing nothing, he continued his grim work, nailing the left hand in place, then driving a third nail through the ankles. He repeated the process with the other 2 bodies, arranging them on separate trees, arms outstretched like grotesque crucifixes. When finished, he stepped back to view his handiwork. 3 Confederate soldiers, crucified among the pines, heads slumped forward, blood darkening their gray uniforms. "This is just the beginning," Elias whispered to the dead men. "Every one of you who laughed while my family burned will hang like this." He carved a small symbol into each tree trunk, a broken chain, before melting back into the darkness. By dawn, turkey vultures circled above the pine grove. A corporal leaving camp to relieve the sentries found the nightmarish scene and ran back, shouting for the lieutenant. Silas Boyd, still weak from the poisoning, staggered to the edge of the trees. When he saw the crucified bodies, he vomited again, this time from horror rather than sickness. "Cut them down," he ordered, voice shaking. "And for God's sake, cover them before the men see." But it was too late. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Soldiers gathered in small groups, whispering fearfully, crossing themselves or clutching Lucky Charms. "It's the devil's work," one man said, eyes wide. "No man could do such a thing." "It's that Smithy," another countered. "Ain't seen him since yesterday." Boyd's face hardened as understanding dawned. "The one who fixed our wagon." He turned to Miller. "Get the dogs. I want that black bastard found and strung up by nightfall." The camp erupted into activity. Dogs barked excitedly as they were brought forward and given the scent from Elias's abandoned bedroll. Horses were saddled, rifles loaded. By then, Elias was already miles away, moving steadily eastward through the dense woods. He heard the distant baying of hounds, but kept a steady pace, conserving his strength. He'd planned for this, prepared during his days with the convoy. When the dog's howls grew louder, he veered toward a shallow creek that cut through the forest. The water ran cold around his ankles as he waded upstream, washing away his scent. At each bend, he scraped his boots with pine sap, further confusing his trail. After a mile, he left the creek and continued east, listening carefully for pursuers. The dogs' voices faded, then rose again, but farther south. They'd lost his trail. As afternoon approached, Elias stumbled upon a small clearing where a weathered church stood in silent neglect. Its white paint had peeled away, leaving gray boards exposed to the elements. The steeple listed slightly to one side, and several windows gaped open, their glass long gone. Cautiously, Elias approached the abandoned building. The door hung loosely on one hinge, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light that penetrated the damaged roof. Pews lay overturned. Hymn books scattered across the floor, their pages yellow and curling. Elias moved slowly toward the altar at the front, a simple wooden table now scarred with knife marks and bullet holes. Spread across the altar lay a torn Union flag, its stars and stripes dulled by dust, but still recognizable. Someone had arranged it carefully, almost reverently, before leaving the church. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the forest canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Elias stumbled forward on raw, bleeding feet. His stolen Confederate coat hung in tatters from his broad shoulders. He'd abandoned his boots after crossing the creek. They'd been too wet and heavy, slowing his escape. That decision now punished every step as twigs and stones cut into his soles. Hunger twisted his stomach into knots. He hadn't eaten since fleeing the camp. The few berries he'd found had barely taken the edge off his starvation. His mouth felt like cotton, his throat parched and raw. Pushing through a thicket of brambles, Elias suddenly emerged into a small clearing. He froze, blinking against the bright afternoon light. Before him stood a dozen tents arranged in neat rows. Men in blue uniforms moved about with purpose. A cook fire smoldered in the center, the smell of beans and salt pork making Elias's stomach cramp with want. But what stopped his heart was the sight of the men themselves, black men in Union blue, carrying rifles with the confidence of soldiers, not the furtive caution of fugitives. Some cleaned weapons, while others mended uniforms. One man scribbled in a journal. Another read aloud from a newspaper to a small group. Above them, hanging from a makeshift pole, fluttered a captured Confederate banner, its stars and bars a mockery beneath the U.S. flag that flew above it. Elias took one hesitant step forward. A twig snapped under his bare foot. Instantly, every man in the clearing turned. Rifles lifted, orders barked. A tall, broad-shouldered soldier with sergeant's stripes stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Elias's chest. "Hold right there," the sergeant commanded, his voice deep and steady. "State your business." Elias tried to speak, but his parched throat produced only a rasp. The world tilted sideways His legs, pushed beyond endurance, finally gave way. As he collapsed to his knees, he managed to whisper, "I'm not their man." Then darkness swallowed him. Cool water touched his lips. Elias swallowed greedily, then coughed as some went down the wrong way. "Easy now," said the deep voice from before. "Drink slow, or you'll make yourself sick." Elias blinked, his vision clearing. He lay on a blanket inside a tent. The sergeant from the clearing sat beside him, holding a tin cup of water. "I'm Sergeant Isaiah Green, 5th United States Colored Troops," the man said, offering the cup again. "And you're wearing what's left of a Confederate coat. That makes for an interesting story, I imagine." Elias took the cup with trembling hands. "Elias," he croaked. "Elias Crow." "Well, Mr. Crow, once you've had your fill of water, perhaps you can explain why a black man wearing gray is running barefoot through Confederate territory." Over the next hour, as strength returned, Elias told a careful version of his story. The plantation, his escape, joining the Confederate supply wagon as a smith. He mentioned Lydia and his son, their deaths at Confederate hands. But he left out the poisoned whiskey, the crucified sentries, his mission of vengeance. Green listened without interruption, his dark eyes missing nothing. When Elias finished, the sergeant studied him for a long moment. "We could use a blacksmith," Green said finally. "Our supply lines are stretched thin, and we're always short on repaired equipment. Can you fix a broken bayonet? Shoe a horse?" "I can fix anything made of metal," Elias said, something like hope flickering in his chest. "Good." Green stood. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're able, you'll start work." At the tent flap, he paused. "And Crow, don't try to run. We're 50 miles behind Confederate lines. There's nowhere to go but with us, or back to them." The next morning, Elias's feet still ached, but Green provided him with ill-fitting boots and led him to a small portable forge set up at the edge of the camp. A modest pile of broken metal items waited for his attention: bent bayonets, a cracked horseshoe, a rifle with a twisted barrel. As Elias worked, stoking the small fire and hammering metal back into shape, he watched the camp with wonder. Black men in uniform moved with purpose and discipline. They called each other corporal and private. They read books in their spare moments. They spoke of battles won and strategies planned. It was a world Elias had never imagined possible. A young private brought him lunch, beans and hardtack, and watched as Elias straightened a cavalry saber. "You're good with metal," the young man said. Elias nodded, uncomfortable with the conversation. He'd learned long ago that silence kept him alive. Throughout the day, he repaired what he could. The work felt good, familiar, yet different. Here, no overseer watched with a whip. No one hurled curses if he paused to wipe sweat from his brow. The soldiers thanked him when they collected their repaired items. Between tasks, Elias found a broken sword blade, snapped off near the hilt. Instead of discarding it, he set it aside. When the day's work was done, he returned to the forge and began shaping the metal into something new, a knife with a long, curved blade. With painstaking care, he carved a name into the wooden handle he'd fashioned: Lydia. Sergeant Green appeared as Elias quenched the finished blade. "That's fine work," he said, nodding at the knife. "For protection," Elias explained, tucking it into his belt. Green studied him, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn book. "Can you read, Crow?" Elias shook his head. "It was forbidden where I came from, too," Green said. "But I learned anyway. A man should know words as well as weapons." He opened the book and pointed to a word. "This says freedom." Elias stared at the strange marks on the page. "Freedom," he repeated. Green pointed to another word. "Duty! Duty! Union! Union!" Elias echoed, tracing the shapes with his finger. That night, the men gathered around the campfire. They shared coffee and stories laughed about home and sweethearts. Elias sat at the edge of the circle, silent but listening. It felt strange to be among men who wore their dignity so openly. Sergeant Green settled beside him, nursing a tin cup of coffee. "You've got the hands of a builder, not a destroyer," Green said quietly, nodding toward the repaired equipment stacked nearby. "You could make something after this war ends." Elias stared into the flames, watching them dance and leap. The fire reminded him of the plantation burning, of Lydia's screams that he'd never heard but imagined every night. He felt the weight of the knife at his belt, the weapon he'd named for his dead wife. Builder or destroyer? The question hung between them in the night air. Elias couldn't answer. He simply watched the fire consume everything it touched, turning solid wood to ash and ember, just as hate had consumed whatever gentle man he might have been before. 3 nights later, the camp stirred with activity well before dawn. Men rolled bedding, packed supplies, and checked weapons. Horses stamped impatiently as wagons were loaded. The cook fires had been reduced to embers, offering little warmth against the autumn chill. Elias sat on a fallen log, wrapping leather strips around the handle of a repaired cavalry saber. His new boots, though still stiff, no longer rubbed his heels raw. The regiment had fed him well these past days: beans, salt pork, and hardtack. Simple food, but regular meals had put strength back into his limbs. Sergeant Green approached through the pre-dawn gloom, a map tucked under his arm. "Crow," he called. "Got your gear ready?" Elias gestured to a small bundle beside him, a blanket, a canteen, and a sack of smith's tools he'd been given. "Ready as I'll ever be." Green nodded, appraising him with those steady eyes that seemed to look straight through a man. "We're moving out in 30 minutes, following the Mississippi supply route north, then cutting east. Intelligence says Confederate forces are scattered in this area, regrouping after losses at Vicksburg." He paused, then added, "The colonel approved my request. You'll march with us as our armorer, keep our weapons in fighting shape, repair what breaks." Elias looked up, surprised. "You trust me to march with your men?" "Trust is earned," Green said evenly. "But you've worked hard these past days, and we need a blacksmith." He handed Elias a worn blue kepi cap. "Wear this. That Confederate jacket's gone, but better you look the part if we encounter enemy patrols." Elias took the cap, running his thumb over the faded blue wool. It felt strange to hold a piece of a uniform, to be given permission to wear it. "Don't make me regret it, Crow," Green said, turning to leave. "We move out at first light." The regiment marched in tight formation along narrow roads that wound through Mississippi backwoods. 50 men strong, the 5th U.S. Colored Troops moved with discipline and purpose. Elias walked among them, beside the supply wagon where he'd stowed his tools. Above them, the stars and stripes flapped in the breeze. Elias found himself glancing up at it often. He'd never imagined he'd march under any flag, let alone this one. The very idea of it would have earned him 20 lashes back on the plantation. Corporal Jenkins, a young man from Ohio with a ready smile, walked beside him. "First time in a proper army, Crow?" Elias nodded. "First time being treated like a man, too." Jenkins grinned. "Gets better. Wait till we win this war. My pa says we'll get land afterward. 40 acres and a mule. That's the promise." "Land of my own," Elias murmured, the concept almost too big to grasp. For 3 days they marched without incident. Elias repaired weapons each evening by firelight, teaching younger soldiers how to care for their equipment. He slept dreamlessly for the first time in months. The rhythm of the march, the purpose in each step. It steadied something inside him that had been broken since Lydia's death. On the 4th day, scout riders returned with news. A small plantation lay 2 miles ahead, lightly defended by a handful of home guard. The colonel made his decision quickly. They would liberate it. The assault was brief and devastating. The plantation's defenders, mostly old men and boys, scattered after the first volley. By noon, the regiment controlled the property. 37 enslaved people emerged from their cabins, disbelieving their freedom, until Greene read the Emancipation Proclamation aloud in the yard. Elias watched their faces, the same stunned hope he'd felt when Greene first offered him a place in the regiment. Some wept. Others stood silent, afraid to believe. A gray-haired woman fell to her knees and sang a spiritual so raw with joy it made Elias's throat tighten. The overseers weren't so fortunate. 3 had been killed in the fighting. The 4th, captured hiding in the main house, was tried by the colonel for crimes against humanity. The evidence came from the backs of the enslaved, maps of scars telling stories no court in the South had ever heard. By sundown, all 4 overseers lay in shallow graves behind the smokehouse. As twilight settled, the freed people packed what little they owned. Some would follow the regiment. Others would head north on their own. Elias helped load supplies from the plantation stores onto the wagons. In the stable, he found something that stopped his breath. A fine leather saddle with silver stirrups. The name S. Boyd burned into its flank. Silas Boyd, the lieutenant, the cousin, the man who'd laughed about Lydia. The rage Elias thought had quieted roared back to life, a wildfire in his chest. His fingers tightened on the saddle's pommel until his knuckles whitened. That night, after the camp settled, Elias lay awake. Greene's words echoed in his mind. Hands of a builder, not a destroyer. But the knife at his belt, Lydia's knife, whispered older truths. Justice demanded blood for blood. Vengeance was a debt still unpaid. Near midnight, he slipped from his bedroll. The guards, focused outward for threats, paid little attention to a man moving inside the camp. Beyond the plantation's fields stood a large barn where, according to the freed cook, Confederate munitions had been stored just days earlier. Against Greene's orders, against his own budding hope for a different future, Elias crept through the darkness toward the barn. Old habits returned like faithful dogs: how to move silently, how to watch for sentries, how to disappear into shadow. Inside the barn, lantern light revealed stacks of powder kegs and crates of ammunition. The Confederates had moved most of their supplies, but enough remained to create the message Elias needed to send. Working quickly, he arranged a trail of powder, leading from the kegs to the barn door. "This is for you, Lydia," he whispered, striking flint to steel. The powder caught with a hiss, a bright line racing across the barn floor. Elias sprinted into the night, counting heartbeats. The explosion shook the earth. A column of fire shot skyward, lighting the countryside for miles around. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off. The barn collapsed in a fury of flame and smoke. Elias watched from the shelter of a distant oak, satisfaction burning in his chest, as hot as the fire he'd created. Only as the echoes faded did the consequences of his actions sink in. The explosion would alert every Confederate patrol within 10 miles. The regiment's position was now known to the enemy. He returned to camp in the gray hours before dawn, slipping back to his bedroll as though he'd never left, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay staring at the stars, the smell of smoke heavy in the air. By first light, the alarm spread through camp. Riders reported Confederate cavalry approaching from the south, a rapid response force drawn by the explosion. The regiment formed up quickly, preparing to move out. But it was already too late. From beyond the eastern hills came the sound of rifles, a steady rolling volley. Smoke rose on the horizon, thick and black. Elias joined a group of soldiers running toward the sound. They crested a hill and stopped, horror-struck. In the valley below, bodies in blue uniforms lay scattered across a field. Confederate soldiers dragged them into a pile, like farmers gathering brush to burn. Among the dead being collected, Elias spotted a familiar broad-shouldered figure. Sergeant Greene lay face up on the grass, his eyes open to the morning sky. seeing nothing. Green turned his head. Somehow, impossibly, still alive. His gaze found Elias standing on the ridge. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that single look lay understanding, accusation, and final judgment. Elias had chosen his path. The world exploded into chaos. Confederate cavalry swarmed over the eastern ridge, their gray uniforms stark against the morning light. Elias watched in horror as Union soldiers scattered, trying to form defensive lines. Outflanked and outnumbered, the 5th U.S. colored troops fought with desperate courage. Elias grabbed a fallen rifle, running toward where Green lay wounded on the grass. 2 Confederate soldiers spotted him and charged, bayonets leveled. Elias fired, catching the first in the chest. The man fell with a cry. The second lunged at him, but Elias sidestepped and swung the rifle like a club, cracking it against the soldier's head. "Green!" he shouted, reaching the sergeant's side and kneeling. "We need to move!" Blood soaked Green's blue coat, but his eyes were clear. "Too late for me!" he gasped. "Save yourself!" "Not without you!" Elias tried to lift him, but a shot rang out. Dirt kicked up inches from his hand. "There he is!" A familiar voice cut through the battle noise. "The blacksmith!" Elias turned to see Lieutenant Silas Boyd pointing at him from horseback, flanked by 4 riflemen. Before Elias could raise his weapon, something crashed against the back of his skull. The world went black as he crumpled beside Green. Pain dragged him back to consciousness. Elias blinked, his vision blurry. His head throbbed where the rifle butt had struck him. He tried to move his hands, but metal clinked against metal. Heavy iron shackles encircled his wrists, connected by a short, thick chain. He lay in the back of a wagon, bouncing over rutted ground. The smell of blood, gunpowder, and horses filled his nostrils. Blood had dried on his face, pulling his skin tight. Above him stretched a gray sky, promising rain. Somewhere nearby, men laughed. "Well, look who decided to wake up." Lieutenant Silas Boyd leaned over the wagon's edge, grinning despite a swollen, split lip. Blood stained his gray uniform collar. "Major Boyd's old blacksmith, if I'm not mistaken." Elias tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry. He swallowed and tried again. "Where are they?" he managed. "Green and the others?" Boyd's smile widened. "The sergeant? He didn't make it. Most of his men are dead. The rest will hang as traitors." He studied Elias with mocking eyes. "But not you. Not yet." The wagon hit a deep rut, jolting Elias's aching body. He bit back a groan, refusing to give Boyd the satisfaction. "You know, I thought you looked familiar back at the supply camp," Boyd continued. "Couldn't place you then. But my cousin wrote about his skilled blacksmith who ran off after murdering poor Craddock." He shook his head in mock sadness. "A slave who learned to kill but forgot to serve. That's your tragedy." "The only tragedy," Elias said through clenched teeth, "is that I didn't kill you two." Boyd laughed, then leaned in closer. "Do you know what happens to slaves who kill white men? It's not a quick death." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But first, we're going to parade you through every town from here to Richmond. Show all those runners and dreamers what happens when they forget their place." He straightened up. "Think about that while you enjoy the ride." The wagon lurched forward again. Elias lay still, taking stock of his situation. His hands were shackled, but his feet remained free. 3 Confederate soldiers rode beside the wagon, rifles at the ready. Ahead and behind, more gray-clad men marched or rode. A captured Union flag dragged in the dust behind a cavalry officer. Hours passed. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. It washed the blood from Elias's face but soaked through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. The wagon joined a larger column of Confederate troops, many limping or bandaged. A retreating force, battered but dangerous. At nightfall, they made camp in a clearing beside a swollen creek. Soldiers erected tents and built fires despite the drizzle. 2 guards pulled Elias from the wagon and chained him to a wagon wheel. They tossed him a moldy piece of cornbread and a cup of water before moving off to seek shelter. From his position, Elias could overhear snippets of conversation around the nearest fire. "Found them nailed to pine trees," one soldier was saying, his voice hushed. "Arms spread like Christ himself, but with railroad spikes driven through their wrists." "It ain't natural," another replied. "No man does that to other men." "They say it's him," a third voice added, pointing toward Elias. "The blacksmith, the one they call the Black Reaper." "You're drunk, Jessup." "Ask Lieutenant Boyd. He knows. Why else would we keep him alive? Normal runners get shot." The conversation shifted to whispers too low for Elias to catch, but he felt their eyes on him, fearful and wondering. The rumors had spread farther than he'd imagined. His handiwork in the pines had become legend, growing with each telling. Lieutenant Boyd emerged from a tent and crossed to the wagon. Rain plastered his hair to his skull as he stood over Elias. "Comfortable?" he asked, smirking. "I've had worse beds," Elias replied. Boyd's smirk faltered. "My men are afraid of you. They think you're some kind of devil." He crouched down. "But I know better. You're just a man, a slave who forgot his chains." "Your chains," Elias corrected. "Not mine." Boyd backhanded him across the face. "These chains," he snarled, grabbing the iron links between Elias's wrists, "are yours until you die. And you'll die slowly. I promise you that." He stomped away, barking orders at his men. Elias tasted blood where his lip had split. He spat it onto the muddy ground. As night deepened, the camp quieted. Only sentries remained awake, huddled beneath oilcloths against the rain. Elias tested his shackles, feeling the weight and thickness of the iron. Good quality work, but not his own. He knew every chain he'd ever forged. Rainwater ran down his arms and pooled in his palms. He stared at his reflection in the small puddles, his face distorted, eyes dark with purpose. Through the gloom, he could make out wounded Confederate soldiers watching him from their makeshift shelters. Their faces were gaunt with hunger and fear. At sunset, Elias looked at his shackled wrists, the same iron he once forged, and whispered, "Iron remembers fire." 2 nights later, the rain that had been falling steadily turned violent. Thunder crashed overhead as a Mississippi storm unleashed its full fury on the Confederate camp near the flooded Yazoo River. Wind howled through the trees, bending them at dangerous angles. Soldiers scrambled to secure tents and supplies as water poured from the sky in blinding sheets. Elias sat with his back against the wagon wheel, soaked to the bone, but alert. The storm had driven most of the soldiers to whatever shelter they could find. Even his guard, a young private with hollow cheeks and a persistent cough, huddled miserably beneath a canvas tarp 10 feet away, his rifle clutched to his chest. The camp descended into chaos. Campfires sputtered and died, plunging the area into darkness broken only by flashes of lightning. Men shouted to be heard over the roar of wind and thunder. A tent collapsed nearby, sending soldiers scrambling and cursing into the night. Elias tested his chains again. The rain had made his wrists slippery, but the shackles remained tight. He looked toward the nearest fire pit, where embers still glowed beneath the partial shelter of a wagon cover. An idea formed in his mind. He shifted position, groaning loudly enough for his guard to hear. "Shut up over there," the young soldier called, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "My leg!" Elias shouted back. "I think it's broken. The wagon shifted." The guard hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his meager shelter. Finally, with a frustrated curse, he slogged through the mud toward Elias. "What's the problem?" he demanded, rain streaming down his face. "The wheel!" Elias gasped, pointing with his shackled hands. "It rolled back when the ground gave way." The guard leaned closer, peering through the darkness. In that moment, Elias kicked out hard, sweeping the soldier's legs from under him. The young man crashed face first into the mud with a surprised cry. Before he could recover, Elias looped his chain around the guard's throat and pulled tight. The man thrashed, but Elias held firm, his muscles hardened by years at the forge. Within minutes, the struggling stopped. Working quickly, Elias searched the unconscious guard, but found no keys. Without them, he needed another way to free himself. He dragged his chain toward the dying fire, the links scraping across muddy ground. The guard's body would be discovered soon. He had minutes at most. At the fire pit, Elias thrust his shackles deep into the glowing embers, using a stick to push aside wet ashes. Pain seared his wrists as the metal began to heat, but he didn't pull back. Through the years, he had built calluses thick as boot leather from working hot iron. Pain was an old friend. "Iron remembers fire," he whispered, watching the chain begin to glow red in spots. A sudden shout cut through the storm noise. Someone had found the guard. Elias worked faster, poking and stirring the embers to concentrate their heat. The chain now glowed orange-red between his wrists. Footsteps splashed through mud, approaching fast. With no more time to spare, Elias yanked the heated chain from the fire, swung it in a wide arc, and hurled it at the approaching soldier. The man screamed as hot metal struck his face. He fell backward, his rifle discharging into the air. The sound was lost in a crash of thunder, but the flash drew attention. More shouts rose from the camp. Elias didn't wait. He ran toward the river, where several flatboats were moored for crossing. The storm had turned the banks to sucking mud that pulled at his feet with each step. Behind him, lanterns bobbed as soldiers gave chase. A massive gust of wind slammed through the camp. Canvas tore free from stakes. A large tent collapsed entirely, trapping men beneath it. The confusion gave Elias precious seconds. He reached the first boat and found 3 Union soldiers chained inside, survivors from Greene's regiment. Using a rock, he smashed at his weakened chain until one link, softened by the fire, gave way. His hands came apart, though the shackles remained on his wrists. "Hold still," he told the prisoners as he worked on their chains with the same rock. The metal, cold and wet, wouldn't break as easily as his own had. "They're coming," one prisoner warned, eyes wide with fear. Elias glanced back to see lantern light drawing closer. He made a quick decision. "Into the river," he ordered. "The current will carry you downstream. Union lines are 10 miles south." "We can't swim in chains," another protested. "Better than hanging here," Elias replied, helping them over the side one by one. The swollen river swallowed them, their dark heads barely visible against the churning water. Elias turned to face the approaching soldiers. Through sheets of rain, he spotted Lieutenant Boyd, shouting orders from horseback. Their eyes met across the distance. Hatred flared between them like lightning. Without hesitation, Elias plunged into the woods beside the river. Branches whipped his face as he ran, but the storm covered the sound of his passage. He circled back toward the horses, where chaos still reigned. Animals neighed in terror as wind tore at their shelter. In the confusion, Elias untethered a bay mare. She reared when he approached, but he spoke softly, calming her with words his father had taught him long ago. Once mounted, he rode hard away from the river, not north toward freedom, but southeast, following the tracks of Boyd's horse in the mud. Rain washed away most signs, but Elias had tracked game through swamps since childhood. Boyd's horse had distinctive hoof prints, a crack in the right front shoe that left a sharp edge in the mud. Hour after hour, Elias followed, losing the trail twice before finding it again. By dawn, the storm had weakened to a steady drizzle. Elias paused on a ridge, studying the terrain ahead. The tracks joined a wider road heading east, toward territory he knew too well. A cold certainty settled in his chest. Boyd was retreating to the Tillman Plantation, Elias's birthplace, the very ground where he had first been shackled, where he had learned to hammer iron, where his name had been stripped from him. Intelligence from Greene's men had mentioned Confederate forces converting larger plantations into hospitals for their wounded. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the flooded landscape. Elias dismounted and let the exhausted mare drink from a puddle. He found a dead Confederate soldier, half buried in mud at the roadside, killed by a falling tree. The man's rifle was still dry inside its oilcloth wrapping. Elias stripped the weapon, checked its firing mechanism, and shouldered it. He looked eastward as lightning split the sky once more, briefly revealing the silhouette of tall oaks he remembered from childhood. The entrance to Tillman Boyd's plantation. "Coming home," he whispered to the storm. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Tillman plantation. The storm had passed, but dark clouds still hung low, turning morning into a gray half-light. The grand house stood like a wounded beast. Windows boarded, white columns stained with smoke from cooking fires. What had once been carefully tended cotton fields now served as a sprawling hospital camp, where rows of Confederate wounded lay on blankets beneath hastily constructed canvas shelters. Elias crouched in the tree line, watching. The plantation he'd known since birth was a shadow of itself. Weeds choked the once pristine gardens. The slave quarters stood empty, their doors hanging open. War had come home. Moans drifted across the muddy yard, the sounds of men dying slowly. Harried medical orderlies moved among them, their white aprons stained brown with blood. Two soldiers dug graves at the edge of the property, their shovels slicing wetly into the sodden earth. Elias tugged the stolen gray coat tighter around his shoulders. He'd found it on another dead soldier along the road. It fit poorly, but might let him pass unnoticed at a distance. He checked the rifle once more, ensuring the powder hadn't gotten wet, then circled toward the back of the property where the kitchen garden once stood. The smell hit him first, the sweet rot stench of gangrene and infection. Then the flies, thick clouds of them hovering over men beyond saving. Some soldiers called weakly for water as Elias walked past, his head down, shoulders hunched to appear smaller. None looked closely at his face. Near the old smokehouse, Elias spotted 3 black men loading supplies into a wagon under the watch of a single guard. They moved with the careful slowness of the enslaved, not working hard enough to finish quickly, not slow enough to invite punishment. Elias recognized that pace in his bones. The guard turned away to light a cigarette. In that moment, Elias struck. One blow with the rifle butt, and the man crumpled without a sound. "Stay quiet," Elias whispered to the startled workers. "I'm not here to hurt you." The oldest of the 3 stepped forward, squinting in the dim light. "Elias? Elias Crow!" Elias felt a jolt of recognition. "Jonas?" Jonas, thinner, grayer, but unmistakably the same man who had watched Elias flee the night he burned the forge, the man who had called after him to go north. "They said you died," Jonas whispered, "after you burned the overseer." "Not yet," Elias replied, dragging the unconscious guard behind the wagon. He took the man's pistol and handed it to Jonas. "How many more of our people are here?" 7 working the hospital, 4 in the fields. Jonas gripped the pistol like it might burn him. "What are you planning?" "Justice." Elias checked the fallen guard for ammunition. "Can you get word to the others without being seen?" Jonas nodded slowly. "What should I tell them?" "Tell them to be ready. When they hear the first shot, take whatever weapons they can find and meet at the old oak." While Jonas slipped away, Elias bound and gagged the guard with strips torn from his own coat. He moved toward the main house, keeping to the shadows of dying oak trees that had once lined the carriage path. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, the world of a child made real in a man's eyes. 2 sentries stood at the front door, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. They looked half asleep, worn down by the long night of storm. Elias circled to the servants' entrance at the back. The kitchen door hung open. Inside, a young black woman stirred a pot of thin soup. She gasped when she saw Elias, but he pressed a finger to his lips. She nodded once, pointing upstairs with her wooden spoon. Understanding passed between them without words. The masters were above. Elias moved through the house like a ghost. He knew every creaking floorboard, every hidden corner. In the parlor, wounded officers lay on fine furniture dragged from throughout the house. None stirred as he passed. Upstairs, voices came from behind a closed door, the master's study. Elias pressed his ear against the wood. "Gangrene spreading faster than we can cut it," someone was saying. "We've run out of chloroform." "Then use whiskey," another voice replied. Unmistakably, Silas Boyd's, though weaker than Elias remembered. "The Yankees will be here within days. We need to move the wounded who can travel." Elias waited until the conversation ended, and footsteps moved away. Then he slipped into an adjacent room to wait. Outside, the plantation stirred to reluctant life. More wounded arrived on creaking wagons. Orders were shouted across the yard. Through a window, Elias watched Jonas moving among the other workers, whispering as they passed. An hour later, Elias heard a door open and close. Peering out, he saw a doctor leaving the study, wiping bloody hands on a rag. Elias counted to 50, then moved. The study door wasn't locked. Inside, Lieutenant Silas Boyd lay on a camp bed, his face gray with pain and fever. His right leg ended mid-thigh, the stump wrapped in dirty bandages. The smell of rot filled the room. Boyd's eyes flickered open at the sound of the door closing. They widened with recognition, then fear. "You," he whispered. Elias stood at the foot of the bed, rifle loose in his hands. "Me!" Boyd struggled to sit up, then fell back, gasping. "Have you come to kill me, blacksmith?" "I've come for justice." A bitter laugh escaped Boyd's cracked lips. "Look at me. I'm already dying. What more justice do you want?" Elias stepped closer. On the bedside table sat a half-empty bottle of morphine and a syringe. Boyd's eyes followed his gaze. "Give me that before you kill me," Boyd pleaded. "One kindness, for God's sake." Elias picked up the bottle, turning it in his hands. The power to ease pain or extend it. A choice he'd never been allowed before. "Did my wife beg for mercy?" Elias asked quietly. "Did my son?" Boyd closed his eyes. "I never saw your wife. It wasn't me. It was your family, your cousin, your world that burned them." Elias set the morphine down, just out of Boyd's reach. "And now, I'll burn it all back." The sky bled orange and crimson as Union soldiers approached the remains of Tillman Plantation. Smoke still curled from the blackened ruins, 10 days after the fire had claimed it. Captain James Monroe, of the 9th Massachusetts Infantry, covered his nose with a handkerchief as his men spread out across the grounds. "Sweet Jesus," his lieutenant whispered. "What happened here?" Bodies lay scattered across the muddy yard. Some burned beyond recognition, others sprawled where they had fallen while trying to flee. Most disturbing were the ones found inside what remained of the main house. Each corpse bore the same mark, a chain-link pattern burned into flesh, as if someone had pressed hot metal against their skin before or after death. "This wasn't battle," Captain Monroe said, kneeling beside one of the bodies. "This was execution." His men moved carefully through the ruins, counting the dead. Nearly 40 Confederate soldiers, most wearing tattered gray uniforms that marked them as hospital patients. No Union casualties, no signs of military engagement. "Captain," a young private called from what had once been the forge. "You should see this, sir." Monroe ducked through the charred doorframe. The forge itself still stood. Built of brick and stone, it had survived while wooden structures collapsed. Inside, the floor was stained with dark pools of dried blood. "Found these, sir." The private held up a pair of metal shackles, melted and twisted as if someone had hammered them beyond use. Beside them lay a blacksmith's hammer. Its wooden handle burned away, but the metal head intact. Carved into its surface were two simple letters, E.C. "What do you make of it, Captain?" the private asked. Monroe turned the hammer in his hands. "Someone settled old accounts." Another soldier approached, holding a leather-bound book rescued from the study. "Plantation records, sir. Looks like this place belonged to Major Tillman Boyd. Lists of property." His voice tightened on the last word. Monroe flipped through the pages, scanning columns of names and dollar amounts. Human beings reduced to inventory. He stopped at one entry. Elias Crow, blacksmith, $200. Next to the name, someone had drawn a small chain. "Gather what evidence you can," Monroe told his men. "Then we'll bury the dead and move on. Richmond's fallen. The war's nearly over." As they worked, Monroe noticed one of his black soldiers staring at the burned hammer. The man's face showed neither shock nor sadness, only grim understanding. "Private Williams," Monroe said. "Something on your mind?" Williams straightened. "Just thinking, sir. Iron remembers fire. What's that mean?" "Something my granddaddy used to say. Means some wrongs burn too hot to forget." 3 months later, in a small Mississippi church, children gathered around a tall man with burn scars on his hands and face. His voice was soft as he read to them from a tattered Bible rescued from the ruins of war. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free," he read, his finger tracing each word carefully. The man who called himself Reverend Thomas had appeared in the war's aftermath, walking out of the swamps with nothing but the clothes on his back and an old hammer hanging from his belt. He spoke little of his past, but worked tirelessly to help war orphans, both black and white, left behind in the chaos. "Reverend," a small girl asked, touching the scarred side of his face, "did it hurt? When you got burned?" The man they called Thomas smiled gently. "Pain passes, child. It's what we build after that matters." In the back of the church, a Union administrator named Phillips watched with suspicion. When the children scattered for lunch, he approached. "Interesting sermon today, Reverend." "All that talk about forging new chains." Thomas's face remained calm. "Not chains of bondage, sir. Chains that link people together. Family, community, the bonds we choose." Phillips studied the scars on the man's hands. "Strange stories circulating about you. Some say you appeared the same day Tillman Plantation burned. Others claim you're the one they call the Ghost of Vicksburg." Thomas's eyes revealed nothing. People need stories in hard times. 3 former overseers found dead last month, all with chain marks burned into their chests. Phillips leaned closer. "War's over, Reverend. Vengeance isn't justice." "No," Thomas agreed quietly, "but sometimes justice needs vengeance to be born." He picked up his Bible. "Now, if you'll excuse me, the children need feeding." Phillips watched him go, unsettled by the man's stillness, the calculated gentleness that seemed to hide something harder beneath. That night, Thomas sat alone on the church steps, watching stars emerge. A figure approached from the shadows, a thin man with graying hair. "Didn't expect to find you preaching the Lord's word," Jonas said, settling beside him. "Just words that need speaking." Thomas, once Elias, didn't seem surprised to see his old friend. "They still hunt you," Jonas said. "The old plantation families, the ones who survived. Let them hunt. I'm not hiding." Jonas studied his face. "Those children love you. Children see clearer than most. They don't care about my scars. What will you do when the last ones who deserve your justice are gone?" Elias looked toward the horizon. "Build something new, maybe." In the morning, Jonas found the church empty. Reverend Thomas had left before dawn, leaving only a note asking Jonas to care for the children. The former slave watched from the riverbank as a solitary figure walked into the morning mist. 2 weeks later, a Union patrol found an abandoned forge beside the Pearl River. The coals still glowed faintly, as if recently used. On the anvil lay a single iron spike, cooled and polished to a shine. Engraved in careful letters was one word: freedom. The soldiers searched but found no trace of who had worked there. Only footprints leading to the water's edge, and then vanishing. Back in Washington, the spike was added to a collection of war artifacts. Scholars debated its meaning. Was it a memorial? A threat? A promise? In the decades that followed, the legend grew. Former slaves told stories of a scarred preacher who appeared wherever injustice lingered, who forged chains not of bondage, but of community. Others whispered of darker tales, of former slavers found dead with chain marks burned into their flesh, even years after the war had ended. The truth, like the man himself, remained elusive, a ghost drifting between vengeance and redemption, between the world that was and the one still being forged. All that remained certain was what Private Williams had said that day among the ruins. Iron remembers fire, and some wrongs burn too hot to forget. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.